Hello, Dana Abbott here, and welcome to a signature series tutorial by Century Martial Arts. This tutorial will cover interesting points and helpful suggestions on test cutting. One of the first things about test cutting you should understand is how to place the tatami mat on top of the stand. It's very easily done, and you have to use a little force with this. What I have discovered, the best way is to have your dowel right here on top of the stand. Take your mat, which is now soaked and it's very stiff and very hard, and the rubber bands are stretched out fairly well. So it's a nice feeling mat. This has about 24 hours of soaking time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hand and put it on top of the mat, hold it over the peg, and then push down like that. That way will offer the best way to adhere this and pin it to the stand without pushing the center out. If you look at it now, it's nice and straight and ready to cut. After your mat is on the stand, you'll need a sword, of course. One of the swords we're going to be using today is our XL series, the largest one we have. And the reason why is so you can see the cuts and the angle of the blade much easier. What I'd like to do is take this sword now, this shinken, and pull it out of the sheath. At the very beginning, you don't really need to have this sheathed on your side. The easiest way, especially for people who are just starting to test cut, is don't worry about having all this around your waist. Therefore, just take the saya or the sheath and put it down. This way, using the sword without the sheath offers a little bit more simplicity. So after you finish test cutting, you don't have to worry about trying to put the sword back in. But down the road, with practice and determination, you'll be able to sheath and draw the sword with ease before your test cutting. The first few suggestions we should think about is measuring where you are up to the stand. If you're too close, or you're too far away, that has a tendency to produce inferior cuts. Probably the best way for you to begin is measuring your sword where it is in the sweet spot area here. This is where you're going to cut from the last 1/3 out. So if you walk up to your mat and you bring your sword in, you can notice that my sword goes out about this far here. This way I know that I'll be able to strike the mat a little bit easier. You're looking at the mat now and you go, wow, I'm almost a hand length's distance away from here. Shouldn't I be farther back? No, not necessarily. This isn't a 6-foot weapon. This is a 30-inch razor sharp sword. The blade is razor sharp, so you have to come in a little bit closer because that's the way the weapon is made. So don't try to stand back. Try to come in and focus a little bit closer and you'll be surprised on how well your cuts will be. Another point is setting up the sword where your parameters. You don't want to start cutting way up here and swing hard as you can and end up down here trying to stop it as it's cutting into the floor or into your knee. One of the biggest aspects of test cutting is safety. And if you don't understand where your feet, where your elbows, where your shoulders, where your body positioning is, you might put yourself in a difficulty. Therefore, I want you to bring the sword up and start where it's parallel to the floor, and when you finish the cut, try to make it so it is also parallel to the floor when you finish the cut. If you cut down any farther like this, it tells me that your arms aren't conditioned enough to stop the sword on a dime. Remember, starting it isn't the problem. It's finishing the cut and stopping the cut and setting up for the next one, which proves to be a little bit more challenging. So what I'd like to do is stand right in front of the mat like this, push my hand straight out, then lift the sword above my head, just like this. Then you're thinking, well, I have to make a cut and I have to cut on the angles like here and here. One of the biggest problems that we have with test cutting is people trying to get into it and turning their heads like this and seeing the best they can see for the cuts, which on paper looks very, very good. The problem arises is that when you start here and then you drop your head almost looking like you're eating a taco while you're cutting the tatami mat, the problem arises is that your blade starts turning, and instead of making a straight, nice, straight angled cut, you're starting to scoop it out, spooning it out in different areas because your hands are turning. So one of the most important factors is when you test cut, make sure when you start the sword and when you finish cutting the sword, your line of attack, the angle of the cut remains the same. This is very important so you don't have inferior cuts. So now, what I like to suggest is, what is the best way to begin your cuts? I would say start with your right angles. Makes it easy. From 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Now remember, your angle to me and my angle to the mat are opposite. So I say 1 to 7 or hidari keisugiri, or from 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock, which is a migi keisugiri, I want you to see that my angles are going to be slightly different from yours. Also, when we lift up the sword this way and we start making our cuts, I don't want you to do a mixed or match of cuts. I want you to do one cut consistently for the whole mat until you get this down. If you can go from a basic downward diagonal cut, and you can get that into your muscle memory, then we go to the opposite side for our opposite downward diagonal cut. And then from there, we start working against gravity. So let me set this up. I'm going to stand in front of the mat. I want to lift the sword up above my head. And I'm thinking, see these rubber bands? These are going to be more like a focal point for you. You want to cut above and below them, or use those as the cuts depending on how many you want to get out of the mat. The best bet is that I'm going to be cutting 2 to 3 inches down from each one to get as many cuts out of the tatami mat that I can. So I lift the sword up here, bring it in so it's basically parallel. I'm going to now, straight above my head, I'm going to bring it off to the side just a tad so it can begin the angle that way. And now I'm going to make my test cut. Now remember, when you make your test cut, I want you to make sure that your hands are already adjusted and they're holding it tight. When you lift it above your head, your hands are going to feel awkward. Your fingers are going to feel tight, and you're going to loosen up your fingers like this again. Don't. You're losing the spring. You're losing that angle of attack. If you lift your hand above your head and you start moving your fingers again, you have to readjust. It's that simple. So lifting it up, I'm going to bring it over here to the side. I'm going to put it into its slight angle. I'm going to have my hands ringing in nicely, ringing the blade. I'm going to make my first cut. And there's my first cut. See where the sword stopped? I'm going to lift it up again. I'm going to come down a little bit farther and same exact cut. And then I'm going to lift it up again. I'm going to come back down, same exact cut. Lift it up again. Looking at the same angle, I want to make sure that my cuts are consistent. What's going to happen though is that the shorter the mat becomes, the sort of farther the distance you become from the mat. It's just geometry. So always make your adjustments of moving in slightly if you need to. Lifting it up again, looking at the mat, focusing, and bring it over to the angle. I'm going to make another cut. Now, you noticed when I made this last cut, I lifted it up a little bit different and a little too high. So what happened was when I came on down this way, it came in and all of a sudden it started scooping it out just a little bit. As you've noticed, the difference in the first 3 cuts to this one here. And this is what you'll be doing as a beginner. You'll be trying to make a perfect cut, but you'll be getting cuts that are turning this way or turning that way. This tells me that your hands aren't ringing the handle of the blade correctly, or one's ringing harder than the other one. So when I lifted this above my head and I started throwing it down, my right hand wasn't as strong as it could be, and it created a cut that wasn't as good as the others. So let's readjust this. I'm going to lift this above my head again, bring it in parallel, bring it over to the side, look at the target. Make sure that I'm just going to be cutting around where that rubber band is and come in and readjust my angle. There. Now you can see the angle's a lot better again. Just consistent with the last ones. And from here, I want you to understand that if we come up and we want to make another cut because we have this much mat left, no, you're done making your cuts. Especially when there's a wooden dowel underneath here. When the dowel gets wet and it gets waterlogged, a lot of times it gets a little bit, what will we say, a little weak. And sometimes it breaks if you don't hit it correctly. Moreover, if you make a cut, I could probably make a 2-inch cut here, but chances are if it goes into a 3-inch cut, you might cut the dowel. And you don't want to cut the dowel because you have to make another one. Let's go on to the second cut, and that is going to be opposite of the first. Before I did a left downward diagonal cut to my left, and now I'm going to do a right diagonal downward cut to my right, my top left to my bottom right. Exact same angles, just from a different direction and angle of attack. I'm going to do the exact same thing, but on the opposite side. For many of you, you might find this a little challenging because one side offers you a good cut, and then when you go over to the left side or opposite side, you'll find out your cutting technique isn't as straight. If one feels good and the other one feels bad, just remember you need more practice. That's all it is. So down the road, everything will even out. Looking at my mat, I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to measure it. Stand into the mat like this, lift it above my head, bring it into where it's parallel to the floor, as you can see that. I'm going to work on my parameters so I don't overcut. I'm going to lift it up to 12 o'clock. I'm going to bring it over here slightly to 11 o'clock, and I'm going to have my hands already wrung and have this tight. I'm not going to come up here and then wring it. I'm going to have it down here. Have it tight, lift up my hands and keep the wringing tight there. Now, this feels nice and tight. 12 o'clock, bring it over to my 11 and I'm gonna cut from 11 to 5. And with a beginning cut of, bring it back up, another cut, just 2 or 3 inches down from there. Another cut up. Same angle, keep your eyes on the tatami mat and produce another cut. And now you noticed right here, sometimes when you roll the mat, it doesn't hold up as well and it hits just a little angle and it cuts a little bit off. I want you to see this so when you do it, it means that it isn't a bad cut, but it isn't a good cut either. What I'd like you to see is all this extra stuff here, which tells me that you need to cut a little sharper and a little harder, put a little bit more emphasis behind it. So when I'm talking about wringing it, from here to here, it rang really well. But this last little bit of leftover stuff, it needs to cut through this too. Now, how you can alleviate this is maybe put a couple more rubber bands and have maybe 7 or 8 rubber bands on it, and it'll keep it a little bit more tight in consistency when you work on your tatami mat. But otherwise, let's just put a little bit more shibodu or a little bit more ringing on the blade and just cut past all that. So here it is here. I'm going to lift it above my head, bring it parallel to the floor. 12 o'clock, my 11 o'clock, I'm going to look at the mat and I'm going to cut down a little farther. It's time to get past that. And now you notice the cut's a little higher because I got past that. But you can see this is basically from 11 o'clock to about 5 o'clock my clock. Now sometimes you'll see cuts that are from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock instead of 11 to 5. Those are aesthetically more pleasing, but then again at the very beginning of cutting your mats, I don't want you to be aesthetically pleasing. I want you to be consistent, because down the road you can cut beautifully. But right at this time, I want you to understand practical application. Measure up, lift it above my head, parallel to the floor. Bring it over to 11 o'clock, parallel to the floor, looking at the mat, trying to come in with an angle, and I'm going to make this a little bit different angle to make it more pleasing to the eye. And now that brought it down a little bit, made it a little bit more pleasing to the eye. You can see that it isn't hard to cut. If my angle of attack is a little bit off, you'd notice it by the topography difference in the mat. Lifting this up again, setting it up, and you don't have to cut fast. Take your time and look at it. Maybe walk away for a minute and then come on back and finish the test cutting. So I'm setting this up, bottom, up here, 11 o'clock. Look at the target, make sure everything's nice, and let's make a cut. Whoa, did you notice I didn't take off too much? I just took off about a ½ inch. So you can see if I really wanted to, I could get maybe 10 or 12 cuts out of this mat. But a lot of times it's better if you get 3 or 4 inches just because it will feel better when it hits the ground. And as a beginning cutter, it feels like you got some meat into the cut. Let me take this up again, readjust the angle, and there. There's a real nice aesthetic cut for the very end of it. As I want you to see, the cuts are consistent, and if they're not consistent, they're fairly close. And again, if you're cutting your tatami mats and you're finding that one cut is good and one cut isn't, don't worry about it. More practice creates perfection.